Welcome, everyone. All right, I think we can get started. Welcome, everyone. This is the second part of Stop the Money Pipeline's four-part workshop series. My name is Jack Fielder. I'm the co-director of Stop the Money Pipeline Coalition. And today we're talking about immigration justice. This workshop series is about broadening our ideas of climate justice. And the reason why we started this workshop series is because the fight to mitigate climate change has often been framed through the framework of carbon essentialism, which articulates the urgent need to reduce carbon emissions on a rapid timeline. Though necessary and not problematic on its own, though, in some corners of the climate movement world, the focus on carbon can sometimes overshadow, and in the worst cases, compromise critical components of not only a green, but also a just world. To ensure that the transition is just, we need to broaden our understanding of what climate justice really means. And all four workshops are designed for people who are actively engaged in the climate movement. Organizers, staff, with NGOs, volunteer leaders. If you are playing an active role in the climate movement, these trainings are for you. Want to give a shout out to the JEDI team who has been putting this together. A few of those folks are on this call: Mary Gutierrez, Karina Williams, and other folks who are not just here today. And much thanks to our digital manager, Austin, for being on this call. In the last facilitated panel discussion, we explored how the drive to electrification is creating new sacrifice zones by calling a massive expansion in mining for rare earth minerals. In the next session, we'll discuss how the forces of exploitation and abuse that fuel the climate crisis are also driving the prison industrial complex. In the last workshop, we'll dive into why we need a powerful low-carbon labor movement to successfully take on the massive challenge that fossil capital poses to achieving climate justice. And today, we'll be learning about how climate organizers can act in real solidarity with migrant justice movements. During this training, we'll be joined by organizers and experts from the National Partnership for New Americans, the Immigration Hub, and the Global Strategic Communications Council Migration Project. We'll learn about climate-driven migration, immigration justice groups who are already working on climate, and ways that the climate movement often talks about migration in ways that inadvertently reinforces our opponents' messaging and fails to place us in solidarity with migrants. So without further ado, please welcome to the call Alana Porcino and Nathaniel Hoffman of the GSCC Migration Project.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for hearing me. So my name is Alana. I'm an Afro-Brazilian woman, and I'm based on the unceded land of the Mbia Guarani people, currently known as São Paulo. And together with Nate, I work for the GSCC Migration Project. And we look at the intersection of climate, migration, and the border and surveillance industry. So yeah, Nate, if you can please introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. Very glad to be here tonight. Thank you for joining. Nate Hoffman. I'm a former immigration reporter and living in Boise, Idaho. I've worked with both immigrant justice and climate justice groups over my comms career, and it's really exciting to be bringing all of these folks together to talk about climate justice and migrant justice. And we want to thank the Stump JEDI Committee as well for having the vision for these trainings. And Alana, do you want to introduce the first section?
Yeah, sure. So our agenda for today, we have 3 points. After the first two, we'll have a Q&A session, and after all, a workshop. And we'll begin with the overview of climate-driven migration. So for this topic, we have about 15 minutes. Nate from GSCC and Ahmed Gaya, the senior strategist for the Climate Justice Coalition at NPNA, will take us through the first session. So please, Ahmed, introduce yourself, and you two are very welcome.
Hey everyone, it's really great to be on this webinar, and it's great to see so many of you joining us tonight. My name is Ahmed Gaya. I use he, they pronouns. And as Anna was just saying, I work with the Climate Justice Collaborative at the National Partnership for New Americans, which is a national immigrant rights coalition of about 61 organizations in 43 states that support state and local immigrant rights groups around inclusion efforts, welcoming, and integration and inclusion. If y'all are hearing a little bit of background noise, I'll say that this webinar is particularly exciting for me because I have a deep love for the Stop the Money Pipeline Coalition and the work that y'all do. I am actually in a closet of the convergence space in New York, where I have been leading trainings for the Stop the Money Pipeline actions this week. So that is why there's a little bit of background noise in the background, and I hope it's not too distracting as folks are just pitching those actions in the room next to me to a bunch of folks. But just kind of quickly where the Climate Justice Collaborative is, where it came from, what we're trying to do. So we're a project of NPNA, like I said, a coalition of state and local immigrant rights organizations. We were founded just last year in January of 2022 to build the capacity of immigrant justice organizations to engage powerfully in the climate movement and to partner with folks in the climate movement to recognize and advocate for migration as a key climate solution. And I think one key thing that I want to flag is that we were created at the behest of our member organizations. So state and local groups asked NPNA to launch this project to support them in working on climate. And many of those groups that asked us to do that did so because of a lot of push from their members to engage on climate. They're members who are feeling the impacts and uniquely feel those impacts as immigrants and refugees here in the United States, wanting to work on this issue with immigrant rights organizations that they were members of. So we organize immigrants both as a frontline community here in the US, and we see immigrants as one of the key frontline communities in this that are feeling unique impacts from the climate crisis, and as the people who are now and will be forced to migrate here in the future. We have three kind of core issue areas that we work on. Obviously, the one we're going to talk about tonight is building safe pathways for climate displaced people to seek refuge here in this country. The other two are around extreme weather and the way that immigrant communities and refugee communities are often uniquely exposed to extreme weather and left out of our unequal and inequitable disaster recovery system, and making sure that immigrant and refugee communities are included in a just transition to clean energy and reap the benefits of that just transition. So we also see ourselves just kind of quickly as a bridge and a partner between immigrant justice and climate justice orgs. And we really hope to play that role of helping your organizations connect locally with our members, locally in the states that y'all work in, and kind of broadly help our movements connect on both of these issues, bringing immigrant organizations into the fights that are happening around climate policy at the state and national level, and bringing climate organizations into the fight for immigration reform, as climate is a strong and compelling factor that's driving migration, and climate organizations should think about migration and as one of the solutions and one of the forms of adaptation we are going to need to have to a climate disrupted world. So for this training today, we hope just a couple of the top line takeaways are, first of all, in a lot of media and political coverage of climate migration is talked about as this scary, devastating, massive thing that's going to happen in the future. As Nate and Alana will get into, these projections and the stories that are told are really problematic and fuel nativist authoritarian responses to climate change and migration. And we actually have both anecdotal and some really good research data that when we use this alarmist message, we both decrease people's likelihood of supporting climate action and their likelihood of supporting immigrant justice. But those are the messages that largely the climate movement heretofore has relied on. So we'll spend a lot of time on this webinar talking about those narratives and how to reframe them. But for this first section, we're just going to briefly talk about what we know, how climate change is impacting migration, how we understand it will happen in the future, how it's happening now. And Nate's going to walk us through that section. And then I'm going to introduce kind of a frame for how we think about migration in the context of climate change and migration as a form of adaptation, as opposed to as one of the consequences of climate change, as it's often framed. So I'll pass it over to Nate to talk a little bit about kind of what we know now in the data and the projections of how climate is impacting migration.
Awesome. Thank you, Ahmed. Global Strategic Communications Council, I don't think we introduced that at the very beginning. Some of you may have worked with us before. We are an international, essentially a PR firm for climate change issues all over the world in 30, 40 countries. And we have a special project, the migration project that Alana and I are part of, that works on all the things that Ahmed just mentioned, making sure that the global climate movement is listening to the immigrant justice community, finding places of intersection, and essentially working to stop the militarization of borders, which we find to be very linked to expansion of fossil fuel and defense of existing fossil fuel projects all over the world. So I also want to mention I'm filling in here in this section for a real expert, Kaylee Ober, who couldn't join us because of some travel issues. She's a published expert on climate-driven migration. So I'm going to try to illustrate a few of the main points that we want people to know, and then pass it back to Ahmed. There's a few, so I have five items that we think climate activists should know about climate-driven migration. One, and maybe the most important one, is that people don't want to leave their homes. People are fleeing climate disasters, which are becoming extremely apparent to everyone, like across America and across the globe, particularly this year. So people are moving to find safety and dignity and pursuit of happiness in some senses. And so that's really important to keep in mind. This is a humanizing effort that we're trying to combat dehumanizing language, and it's important to center the humans who we are talking about. Secondly, this is a big challenge for us. There's no international designation of climate refugee like there are for refugees who are fleeing war or who are unable to return to their homes for persecution. So it gets very confusing when we have debates and discussion because we don't actually have ways to protect people specifically from climate displacement. And that's true both internationally, like in the UN circles and migration, international migration, and also in the US and EU, there are no solid structures for climate-driven migrants to apply for. So that relates to my next point, which is that climate is a very common reason for displacement. Definitely the most common reason for internal displacement in countries all over the world, but it's often one of many reasons that people migrate. And so we're finding ways of incorporating climate migration into immigration cases. And Khadija is going to talk about that in the next section. But there are certain structures in US immigration law that may apply to people who also have climate as a part of their immigration story. I want to say that climate-linked mobility is a problem in both wealthy and poor nations. I mean, we've seen, I'm going to blank on the number, but it's in the vicinity of 1 million Americans who have had to move because of climate disasters last year. But that there's a great difference in the way that wealthy and poor nations are prepared to handle climate disasters in terms of funding, obviously, and also in terms of who bears the brunt of climate change, which we're all familiar with on this call. And then finally, I just want to remind everyone, I mean, often people will talk about this as a future problem, but that is not, that's not fair to the millions of people who have already had to move from their homes because of climate disaster. So this is something that's very real, and it's affecting people currently. So we shouldn't think of it as some thing to solve in the future, but as we need to be welcoming people now and figuring out these structures now. And so, Ahmed, let me turn it back over to you.
Totally. So Nate was just hitting some of the key points, and we'll come back to some specific ways in which we can actualize this in the narrative. Like this first section of the webinar, like we said, we're going to give you just some more lay of the land of the situation. And we can probably follow up with some writing that Kaylee has done on the kind of specific numbers and like patterns that we're seeing in the way in which people are being displaced by climate change. It's unfortunate that she wasn't able to come. There's some travel issues that happened tonight. But the framework that I want to lay out, and I'll just be brief and then move on to the next section, is that we need to reframe migration due to climate change from one of the consequences of climate change. Right now, we often place it in the category of like climate change is causing storms, floods, wildfires, and migration. So migration is put in this category of scary things, and instead place it in one of the solutions, ways in which we are adapting to and combating a climate disrupted world is by expanding clean energy, building resilience, and expanding pathways for people to seek refuge as the world becomes destabilized. They both are kind of explaining the same phenomenon, but overwhelmingly right now, our frame around migration is as a threat and not as a solution and opportunity. And that fits into kind of a dominant narrative in the United States of migration as a crisis, of migration as a scary and a bad thing. And it's, you know, something that it threatens both of us, both of us, I mean, both the immigrant rights movement and the climate justice movement, because we see already politicians and political and corporate figures who see the climate crisis as an opportunity to profit, see the climate crisis as an opportunity to increase scarcity and promote far-right, restrictive, authoritarian ideology, seizing on that in places and seizing on those fears of mass migration and using that to undermine politics that both take climate action and expand immigrant justice. So this kind of Achilles heel of the climate movement on the way we talk about climate displacement is something we think that the movement really needs to address, and one of the reasons why we were formed. And then right now, Nate talked a little bit about how there are very limited migration pathways for people displaced by climate change. But a thing we want to stress is that there are some existing tools that the Biden administration could use more fully. They are temporary. They are not full solutions. We absolutely need congressional action. There is legislation that Senator Markey, the Climate Displaced Persons Act, was introduced last year that will likely be reintroduced either this year or next year. But some of the things we'll be presenting is a lot of the campaigns you might see and be asked to join in the coming year or two will be around getting the administration to fully use the tools that they have at their disposal to protect folks that are displaced and protect folks that are displaced by climate change. So I don't know if I'll pass it back to Anna. I know we had to juggle things around because some of the cancellations at the last minute. I am starting the next section as well, but I don't know if Anna, you had an introduction you wanted to add, or I should just jump right into that.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Ahmed. I just wanted to highlight how important is what you just brought about migration being framed as a threat instead of a solution. So for the next session, I won't need to ask you to introduce yourself, but I really want Khadija Garnett to introduce. Is also the Director of Leadership, Development, and Engagement at the Immigration Hub. But Khadija, please introduce yourself. You were very welcome. And then for Ahmed and Khadija, you have the microphone.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for the introduction. My name is Khadija, and I have the great honor of having worked with Nate when he was firmly in the immigration space. And so it's really exciting to be still connected and doing this work. So my name is Khadija, and I work at an organization called the Immigration Hub. The Immigration Hub was incubated by the Emerson Collective to provide strategic support to a broad spectrum of partners to help counter escalating anti-immigrant sentiment and restrictive immigration policies. One of the key things that the Immigration Hub does is to serve as a national convener, in addition to driving innovative communications strategies, advancing a pro-immigrant congressional agenda, and fostering collaborative partnerships. The the convening is something that I will be focusing on today, because I have the honor of holding one of those convening spaces through a listserv and weekly calls. I'm going to drop in the chat some information about the Immigration Hub, and I will also come back to drop another link about Amigos, because the Amigos, as it stands currently, is a space for organizations to share updates, resources, and actions on federal immigration and refugee policy issues. So I know Ahmed through Nate, but also through him posting on this on our listserv. It's a significant listserv. We stand at over 1,000 advocates from over 350 organizations, and I lead weekly calls, and which folks are welcome to attend or not attend. It's not necessary to attend the calls to be part of the listserv. And so when we come back, I'll talk a little bit about some of the focuses that we have, but we would absolutely love to have you all join the listserv. So later on, I'm going to drop some information about how you can join the listserv. But in the meantime, I am going to drop a link to our website so you can read a little bit more about us. And thank you so much.
Khadijah, just to break it up so it's not a lot of me talking in a row, do you want to do your section first after you drop those links?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that, Ahmed. You know, one of the things that I wanted to do, and I was not sure where you wanted to put me, is that I wanted to drop a link so that if people do want to join those calls or the listserv, that they could give me their information. Should I wait for later for that? Or I was going to wait till we both talked, or should I just do it now as I speak?
Why don't you share the section you're going to do and then drop those links, and then we can also send them in the follow-up as well.
Okay, that's perfect. Sounds really great, Ahmed.
Sorry, folks, we had to do a little reshifting at the last minute because of some speaker changes. So thank you for bearing with us.
It's going great, Ahmed. I really appreciate you and Nate's, walking us through this. So the thing that I do want to talk to you about today is TPS and other administrative relief, because that's one of our focuses right now, is urging the administration to take action. As Ahmed said before, that the goal is to have the administration use any and every tool that they have to provide protections for refugees and undocumented immigrants, which of course includes people who are displaced by climate change. So one of the current focuses we have is TPS designations and redesignations. So designations are countries that have had that protection, which is temporary protected status. It's basically a status where folks are saying that their country conditions back home are so desperate that they are too dangerous for them to return to. So they granted this status, temporary protected status, so that they may remain in the United States and they have ability to work. And TPS recipients tend to have been in the country for years, decades even. So incredibly established communities. So that's the designations. Now, redesignations are where folks have already had. So for example, Haiti is, as you know, there's quite a bit of strife in the country, including a lot of natural disasters. So they have TPS designation currently. And the thing that we would be asking for is for a redesignation. But then there's also nations which, like the Democratic Republic of Congo, which country conditions are rapidly devolving. And so we're advocating for designation. So for the first time, there's several countries that we're looking at right now, which a combination of these countries, if they were provided protected status, it would cover a significant portion of the currently undocumented in the United States. And you will hear from the countries that I'm going to speak on that they are countries which are impacted by weather events and so on that are driven by climate change. So a key group of countries are countries in Central America, including Venezuela, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Honduras, also Haiti, Sudan, South Sudan, and Ukraine just got redesignation. Cameroon and Mali, and as I mentioned, the Democratic Republic of Congo, also other countries that we're pushing for. So when on Amigos, we talk about different federal issues related to immigration. And so it's not always just one thing, but a key point of advocacy right now is this TPS designations, because one, the administration can do this without Congress. So it avoids some of the gridlock that Ahmed was talking about when it comes to passing legislation. It's something that they can take action upon right now. And then the other thing is that it just covers such a tremendous number of people. The other thing that we are highlighting is asking the administration to provide protection for DACA recipients. As you know, the DACA program is in jeopardy, as it is once again before a federal judge in Texas who has previously ruled the program illegal. So at the moment, DACA recipients who well, by definition, to have DACA, you have to have been here since you would have come to the United States as a child, and which means that DACA recipients have no other home. So encouraging the administration to find a solution for DACA recipients. Another one is speaking of gridlock, there is gridlock within the system. So we're encouraging the administration to address the unacceptably long green card and work permit backlogs that impact families, including those living in mixed status homes here in the United States. So that combination of those three things is what I'm speaking of when I'm speaking about administrative relief and where we're focused. There are, of course, other steps the administration can take, but these are ones that would be incredibly significant to folks who are here, who have been displaced and do need immediate interventions to give them legal protections. Ahmed, do you want to, I can keep going, or do you want to step in?
I think this might be a good point because we just dropped a lot of technical information on folks that might be new to them, to just briefly pause. I know we have a question section in a moment, but maybe we should briefly pause and see if there are like one or two clarifying questions about that technical information in the chat. Seeing a nod from Nate. A thumbs up.
Yeah. So what I've dropped in the chat is that we would love to see you, on Amigos, and you will be able to find more information on the listserv. And one of the things is that we do reach inflection points, or points where folks weighing in, particularly from intersectional movement spaces, will be incredibly significant and helpful. So I dropped in the chat a way that you can connect to the Amigos listserv, but as Ahmed said, I'm here to answer questions. Okay, thanks for flagging, Taylor. It's that the permissions are not working. So I'm working on fixing that. In the meantime, if folks can.
We'll definitely follow up with everybody on the call too, with a bunch of resources. At the end, we have several very useful documents and resources for everyone. So Ahmed, do you want to take it away for a little bit and then?
Cool. I'll jump in. I just wanted to give a brief pause in case someone, like I said, once again, a lot of these terms might be new to folks on the call, in case someone had a clarifying question. And obviously folks should post questions in the chat if they have them. And when we get to the question section in a moment, we'll try and cover them. One piece I just wanted to give before we move into talking more about the narratives is, once again, to kind of emphasize the lay of the land and where immigrant rights organizations like where they're coming from, what their perspective from my experience is and our experience is like in engaging with the climate movement. And the experience that I have to bring to this is that before we launched the Climate Justice Collaborative, we conducted about a 3-year process with immigrant rights and climate organizations to sort of figure out, map the process, see what did immigrant rights organizations need to engage with this. And that process was initiated by folks in the immigrant rights movement. It was initiated by organizations originally in 2018 at the conference that we hold, the National Immigrant Inclusion Conference every year, which does now have a climate track in. I'll just give a shameless plug to that, which we'll be having next year. We encourage you all to come for the climate migration track of that. But folks who had been impacted by Hurricane Michael in Florida, the Camp Fire in California, impacting overwhelmingly farm workers and domestic laborers. It's in both of those places, folks who are being pulled into conversations around their local climate policy, where I was in that time, in Washington State, where we were running a statewide ballot initiative, or over into the PCM processes. And that process was initially held by the People's Climate Movement. And then when the PCM ceased to be a funded entity, NPNA members took on and carried that process. And largely the sentiment we heard from dozens of immigrant rights organizations that we talked to was that our groups care about these issues. We feel that our members have a unique experience, especially with extreme weather, especially with involvement in the clean energy workforce, and obviously with this very pressing issue of the way that climate impacts displacement. But the only time in which we engage with the climate movement is when we are being asked to mobilize for decisions that have been already been made. When we were being asked to show up for the PCM in 2014, or the satellite marches that happened in 2015 and 2016. In this more recent effort, people talked about, being approached by funders because they needed, different diverse communities to lobby senators around Build Back Better and eventually the IRA. And so getting these sort of last minute requests to engage in legislative campaigns for pieces of legislation that we were not involved at all in the creation of. And so we created this piece of infrastructure in part because we really felt that our groups were not having the experience they needed engaging on their own in climate spaces. They needed something that was uniquely rooted in the immigrant rights movement to serve as a bridge between those two places. And we think it's especially important for climate groups to engage in these fights around migration that are directly impacted by climate, because this has to be a reciprocal model where immigrant rights organizations have very real reasons to engage in fighting for state and national policy on climate, on reducing carbon emissions. And climate organizations also have very real reasons for engaging on immigration policy to help build the solutions and the adaptation we need to a climate disrupted world. But if it's only going one way, we're not going to have the kind of solidarity we need to win on either of those things. And so that is just a little bit of lay of the land context from that process that wanted to give. And that there are a lot of projects that our groups are working on right now. Some are working in more traditional climate coalitions or in the Green New Deal spaces, but a lot of them are working on things that look more like adaptation projects. Things like building out resilience hubs in their communities. In Oregon, where I am now, that was a big fight led in part by an NPNA member, Unite Oregon, to win state money for resilience hub funding to build our resilience to wildfires, extreme heat, smoke, etc., across the state for our communities. Folks working on equitable disaster reform, on implementation of the IRA to ensure that our communities reach it. So there is work to be done, and often is adjacent to the work that climate organizations are doing, in the same way that a lot of the carbon reduction campaigns are adjacent to the work that immigrant rights groups are doing. And the way in which we build solidarity is finding these points where our work touches each other and where we are adjacent, and supporting each other in those places. And that's why we think that one of the takeaways from this broad conversation about narratives and engaging in climate migration for in immigrant rights fights for climate groups, is that's one of the takeaways I wanted to give y'all. But with that, I'll pass it over to Nate to drive us into the narrative conversation more directly. Nate and Alana.
Ahmed, can I take a quick second? I had a question in the chat.
Absolutely.
Thank you. So somebody, Taylor asked in the chat how long a TPS designation is, and it's varying depending on how the administration evaluates country conditions, and it can be for 6 months, it can be for 12 months, and it can be for 18 months, so up to 18 months. And then it can be reevaluated and renewed or redesignated, as I spoke of earlier. Thank you so much, and back to you, Nate.
I just wanted to encourage people to raise your hands if you have any questions. So please, this is the first Q&A breakout. We'll have a second one at the end. But if you have any more questions, please raise your hands, and I'm sure they will be happy to answer. Okay, so I think we can move on. Nate, please.
I'm just going to reshare the screen. Second, please. Okay, so this is the heart of the work that Alana and I do in the narrative realm, talking about communicating climate-driven migration, and specifically for folks in the climate justice movement, how to communicate on climate migration. So I just want to preface this with, in the immigrant rights movement, there was sort of a parallel effort over the last 10, 15 years to get more humanizing coverage of immigrants in the press, and specifically to stop reporters from talking about people as illegal, using the term illegal to refer to people. And this culminated with the Associated Press maybe 5 or 6 years ago, actually clarifying in the AP style guide, which most newsrooms in America use, that human beings are not illegal, and you shouldn't refer to them in that way. So in a similar frame, I have up here several recent headlines, including the one on the top left, quoting the Secretary General of the United Nations, that use what we think of as threatening and dehumanizing language to describe people who are fleeing climate disasters. And we see this way too often. And so what this does is it puts the onus or the danger that we're facing, supposedly, onto people who are fleeing for safety, rather than onto oil companies, people who are, nations that are most responsible for the climate catastrophe, and also on the border and surveillance industry. So, we have in the US and in Europe and Australia, very militarized border agencies that feed into a hugely profitable industry that's very closely tied. And I'm going to move to the next slide here, I think. Oh, shoot. Sorry. Wait, it's not supposed to link. Okay, there we go. There's some names on here that many of you are going to find familiar. All the major asset managers, BlackRock, Vanguard, are at the top of this food chain that is funding both fossil fuel development and border and surveillance companies that are making people's journeys more dangerous. And so this is the crux of why we wanted to talk to the STOMP group, is to show that there's great connections between our movements in terms of stopping the financing of both fossil fuels and of the border and surveillance industry. I think last year there was another STOMP webinar that many of you may have been on with Friends of the Earth and the Transnational Institute, TNI, and I'll drop a link to their research in the chat in a few minutes, but they have a pretty thorough paper on the way that this financing works across fossil fuel and border violence industries. So Alana is going to talk about what we do about all this. What's the solutions? Alana.
So yeah, if you can go to the next slide. Okay, so Nate just explained a bit about the dangerous narratives. So how can we communicate without reproducing them? And we use a race class-based narrative, and this means a framework for progressive communications that will follow the three-step structure: value, villain, and vision. So value is something that all human beings can relate to, like an universal value, happiness or love, and in this case is safety. So we have always moved seeking safety. It's something that is has proved to be more efficient when we are talking about shifting public opinion. Then for the second part, we have the villain. So here the purpose is to shift the perspective from the manufactured idea of fearing the other to the real villains. So it also means pointing the figure to the real people, the real organizations that are profiting from human rights violations. And if this part is done well, exposing this failures may improve the chances of leaders addressing safe pathways for refugees and migrants. And it also can bring the opportunity to talk about the violations of the current policies without bringing the responsibility for people's safety on an individual level and giving it back to the structural and public policies. And the last but not least part is the vision. So the vision is what we are aiming for the narrative. Here is the right to move and the right to stay. So the right to move, because safe and dignified migration is part of the solution to the climate crisis. And it is also a way of ensuring that people are able to adapt to a changing environment. And the right to stay, it's regarding the protected communities that will thrive despite impacts of climate change. So safe pathways represent real security for communities. To then pivot a quick example of how you can acknowledge dangerous narratives. So at left, you can see a tweet that was one of the most shared tweets regarding climate and migration the last 2 years. And you can also recognize a lot of the dangerous aspects here. And at the right, you also see like a different tweet with a different narrative after we present the dangerous narrative brief to Greta, and you will see a context, you will see a more humanized narrative. So the general point here is that in order to avoid dangerous narratives, you need to humanize the conversation. And this will mean that you should not use crisis language. You should not talk about migration as a future threat, and also avoid doing future predictions. Talking about climate and migration and the link between them carries a real responsibility, and it means speaking the right words and being really careful with them, because they need to move us closer to just and equitable solutions. And this also means that the global North climate movement must embrace migration as a solution instead of running away from it. And oh, can you go back a bit? Just, yes, one before. Okay, no problem. I will have the last one. Yes, thank you. But well, I just wanted to wrap it up saying that here are some examples of the alternative villain narrative. So it's when you shift the perspective to the real villains. And we had an amazing win last year through the work of one of our partners. So People and Planet, with the campaign Divest Borders, had the first university to divest from the border and surveillance industry. So Cardiff Med joined the campaign, was the first university, and we see this as a real step and a real winning when we talk about shifting dangerous narratives. So yeah, that's it from my side. Thank you so much for your attention. So Nate will move forward and explain a bit about the workshop.
Okay, thank you, Alana. So I see a question from Tess D in here, and I'm gonna hold off answering for a minute because I think this is something we can address in these breakout groups. My bias as a former newspaper reporter and a communicator is for communication. So I know that's not everybody's favorite activity in the movement, but we're gonna do a little comms exercise now. And I think it's important to be able to recognize the threat language. And I think Tess in her comment actually has illustrated this really well, that yes, we are, the whole goal here is to recognize that the climate crisis is the real threat, but to make sure that our language reflects that. And so I'm gonna share a little assignment sheet. We have 4 articles that have various iterations of this dangerous narrative embedded in the headlines or the articles. I'm going to ask each group of about 10 people to pick one of them and to rewrite the headline so that it's framed using the tools that Alana described, so that it's focused on not dehumanizing people and has the correct villains framed. And then also to write a statement or a quote or some kind of short response to the article as if it was coming from, your organization or you as an individual. So I want you to work on those as a group. We're going to try to have one of each of us in each of the groups to just kind of help and answer questions. But feel free to introduce yourselves. We'll have about 15 minutes for this. I think there's some general breakout rules that everybody probably is familiar with at this point. So just be cool with each other and have a good talk. Let me pull up the conversation guide here. Sorry, one second. And Austin, if you want to get ready to send people out to the groups. Okay, so this I think is, yes. Okay, I hope everybody should have access to this document. I just dropped in the link. We'll send it to the groups as well. Let's go for 15 minutes and have a nice discussion about this, and then we'll come back and talk as a bigger group and wrap it up. Thank you, everyone. I'll see you in a little bit. I'm always shocked when that works. Did everybody have a chance to discuss one of the headlines? Okay, excellent. Let's see. So did we lose Alana? Oh, there you are.
Yeah.
Our group finished. It's in the chat.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you
So,
for sitting in.
what, sir, do you have a name? What's your name, sir?
Dan Rothbard. I'm a quality facilitator trained by the government. So I like to have fun with all of you. And I like the fact that you came in. That was very important. We thank you.
Okay, well, I appreciate that, Dan. So let's go through and talk about these headlines. I hope people found that a useful exercise. The group I was in had a very interesting discussion. So does anybody know who group 1 is? Do you know who you are?
I think it might be us.
Okay, so the group that was with Khadija, does somebody want to share which headline and how you guys dealt with it?
Jack, would you like to lead? Jack played so Nan, do you want to speak to
Yeah,
the?
actually, we came out with two different versions of the one about the biblical Exodus, rising seas. We agreed to take out the biblical Exodus stuff. One version was rising seas are forcing millions of people to seek refuge. And Nan, do you want to read yours? You gave it right at the end, and I didn't have a chance to think about it.
Oh, yeah, it was just kind of some of the other things that we talked about. So we were saying like forcing millions of people to seek refuge for our new statement. And then it was the third part, like a quote from your org, just stuff that people were saying was, it is a humanitarian, well, Frankie mainly actually, it's a humanitarian crisis that so many human beings are being forced out of their homes. That's it.
Could you talk about?
I have a pretty great team, right? My breakout group.
Do you want to talk a little just for a minute, like why you took out biblical scale and why you had those two different versions? Can you just say a little bit more? This is my favorite example, by the way, too.
Frankie, do you want to share why we did that?
Sure, haku, because as far as hakuna kumi species kantus maipe. Yeah, I mean, when you're using words like biblical, you have to remember, you know, the history of indigenous peoples and religion and the genocide and everything else within history that happened to our people. So it's not very inclusive of indigenous people. If you're thinking of a narrative or a platform or a framework on how do you be inclusive when speaking about those things. And I think that taking those things into consideration with civil society on a global scale at the UN, dealing with the plastics, the global plastics treaty, you know, we've seen a lot of the crisis that we're talking about now is a human health crisis, which then in turn is a human rights issue, because the continued the system and the infrastructures by industry, whether you want to call it fossil fuels, petrochemicals, you know, false solutions, whatever it may be, is just continuing to perpetuate that harm and poverty predominantly within indigenous Black and brown communities, historically, generationally, and it has happened, it is happening, and it's continuing to happen. And I think that we have to, you know, see those things, acknowledge those things, embrace those things if we're going to really talk about inclusion, you know, being a relative that understands what it means to be not just inclusive, but how to move forward, you know, with those different dynamics and the many different issues that we all face within our own communities. So yeah, I think that, you know, really stating that we're all human beings. This is impacting all of us, and it's driving all human, you know, many human beings throughout this world, or life, just it's driving life out from their homes, and that this climate crisis is that continued harm against not just, you know, the biodiversities and ecosystems in our environment, but human life, and that's why I felt like, you know, removing the biblical sense in those words would be much more inclusive to indigenous peoples. Thank you, Chuck.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, it's super interesting to discuss this in the context of indigenous lands as well, and particularly along the border region. I mean, the tribes along the border are heavily impacted by climate change, heavily impacted by militarization, by the border wall and surveillance. And so, and also heavily supportive in many cases of immigrant rights and welcoming to people trying to find safety here. So yeah, that's a great addition. Let's move to the second group. I think, was that Ahmed's group or on this group.
That was my group, and we were still iterating. I will put the latest our final iteration of that we got to in our group of a headline. We didn't get to the quote section. We picked the last article about report warns 1.2 million people be forcibly displaced from climate change. And this friend, I want to give credit. Fernanda got this version. I think we still could have gotten it a little bit punchier. We did it longer, and then we're punching it down. But the general frame, and I'll let others speak to this as well, was trying to shift it from to the report. What the report is showing is that migration is one of the forms of adaptation we will need. Migration is showing that the report on the impacts of climate is showing that millions of people will need pathways to migrate, kind of framing it as a solution. I know taking away the specific number, because we know that the specific number is very dangerous frame. But I know Fernanda, Lee, others from our group want to share more of the thinking. There was a really good discussion. Sebastian. Oh, I see Sebastian's jumping off, but I don't know if Fernando.
Yeah, I gotta go, guys. I'm sorry. I got class.
worries.
See you guys. It was great.
Anyone else from group 2 want to talk about the issues? I'm glad you picked a different one. One of the reasons I put this one in here is because we talked briefly about numbers, and there's a lot of consternation about this because we're also scientists. Like a lot of people in the climate movement are scientists and live by numbers. But you have to recognize that in the media, when the media uses billions in a headline, there's other meanings behind that, and we don't know how many people. This is speculation as well. So there's many different competing reports. There's many factors involved, and so the reason I put this headline in there because it's a very common one. Every time the UN or one of the research agencies come out with a new number, they get a bunch of stories about it. So did anybody react specifically to the number in this group?
It's something we discussed, but I want to see if any of the other group members want to share. Ted was also in the group.
What was the number?
1.2 billion.
Oh my goodness, that's way out of whack.
Yeah, thank you.
The
I like what
Economist
Frankie
had
wrote here.
400 million last time I read The Economist.
Yeah, well, this is a future projection, but still, your point is solid. Let's jump. Okay, so we're getting down to like 15 minutes. So let's jump to I think group 3 was the group I was in. Does anybody want to present from group 3?
I'll go for group 3. Or sorry, did someone else want to go? Okay, I'll go for group 3. Sorry, y'all. I have my son with me. Hello, everyone. I'm Cheyenne. I'm with Society of Native Nations. I was in group 3. We selected title number 3 just for simplicity's sake. Our original title was "Why the Climate Crisis Will Intensify the Border Crisis." And after consideration of the humanitarian approach, because people are people regardless of circumstances, regardless of location, and regardless of border restrictions, we need to remember people are people. So there was a lot of debate on just how to approach it, from which lens to approach it from. But in the end, we had a very quick vote. We actually ran out of time, and we were only able to cover this. Cover question number 2, which was to retitle the headline. And I just posted in the chat. The original was "Why the Climate Crisis Will Intensify the Border Crisis." We eliminated the word climate crisis because it gave the wrong narrative, and it also has a very stigma attached to it. And we changed the verbiage with border crisis because it was we wanted the humane approach to it. 5 out of 8 voted for climate refugees seek asylum from extreme weathering events. And again, like I said, we didn't have enough time to cover the other ones, but that is what we were able to achieve in that time frame. Thank you.
Good job.
Nice, thank you. Yeah. Sorry, if it's okay with everyone, I'll just reflect on this also. We talked about the term refugee, that it's not a technical term in this case, For a headline, I think, potentially it's okay, although we have to bear in mind it could be confusing because there's not a legal category there. I didn't mention this before, but some, particularly from Latin America, climate-driven refugees prefer to think of themselves as climate refugees, but other groups of climate migrants don't and prefer the term migrant. So this is still very much in flux. It's just something to keep in mind. Let's jump to the last group, Alana's group. Do you want to introduce the topic?
Yeah, sure. So we had a very interesting discussion. As always, the time is never enough for it. So yeah, I really want to invite my group. So maybe Marlena, Cindy, or so yeah, please go ahead and share your thoughts.
Okay, I don't know if anyone else wants to go. We didn't do a bunch of different headlines. I don't even think we settled on one. But one of our suggestions was like climate change threatens coastal communities and homes. Just thinking about centering the fact, people's communities and that they're under attack from climate. And then another part of the discussion was bringing in some human rights language. So we didn't quite settle on a
Marlena, where are you talking about the first one, the rising seas? Is that the one you were
yes,
talking
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, the rising
That's
seas.
okay.
That's the one that we had. Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. I mean, I think you should send that advice to Antonio Guterres, actually.
I got him on speed dial, so
Okay.
just I'll send it right over.
Okay, we're gonna go to the closing section in 1 second, but I have one question and then I want to see if others have questions. I'm curious why nobody chose the national security one, because that's a very common narrative in the climate community that talking about climate change as a security threat, and we can't really get into it all here, but did anybody look at that one or have any feelings about that headline?
Just had one thought about that, which is that I think, we don't talk enough about how economic sanctions and other things that we try to do in the name of national security have a destabilizing effect and actually contribute to political destabilization, and why people feel like they need to come to the US in the first place. And I think in general, reframing some of these conversations around the cruel policies that we have domestically and also internationally can maybe be one tool for reframing the headlines. So for example, you could say, visa backlog causes harm to displaced persons at the border, or something like that, instead of pointing at the impacts or on people, pointing at the policy itself that's contributing to it.
Excellent. Does anybody have any sort of final questions or feedback or thoughts they want to share?
Nate, I just wanted to just highlight to you and ask you for you to add to the resources that you are going to send at the end, that article talking about how the climate threat narrative not only feeds the anti-migrant group, but also how it stops the climate action. So if you can also add this resource, okay? So
sure.
Yeah.
Nate, did you mention the charities that we put into hold on. Did you mention the charities that we asked you to talk about?
So I think it's Dan, right?
Yes, because HIAS, as you know, and International Rescue Committee are definitely promoted in the faith institutes. And they obviously would have some very good language, I would think, that we could use and get with them to get something accomplished in this area. Because as you know, we have over 100 million right now refugees displaced because of the Ukrainian war and so on. And there's a lot of emphasis going on in that area.
Dan, Khadija or Ahmed, would you like to mention a few of the like immigrant rights groups that are actively working on climate issues right now? I think that's what Dan's asking about.
Ahmed, I think I'll defer to you.
Yeah, well, I'll share that. One, I've named that like our organization, the National Partnership for New Americans, is attempting to be, a really strong bridge between climate organizations. So especially if you're working at the state level, I can share my contact information in the chat. Feel free to reach out to me, and I can, if there's an attempt to connect you with our members in the state level, and kind of serve a bridge there, and have been doing that for a bunch of our members at the national level. There's a pretty broad coalition of immigrant rights and refugee organizations that have been working on the Climate Displaced Persons Act. And like I said, that'll be reintroduced either this year or next year. And that will be a big moment when we are making a lot of asks of the climate movement, climate organizations to make statements, to sign on to letters, to do education with their members about it. That'll be like a big, it's a marker bill. So it's like unlikely to pass in our political context right now, but it's a great opportunity for us to educate both our members, lawmakers, members of the media, key communicators about this issue, and that's how we're framing it. But some big, oh gosh, I'm having a brain fart right now. Khadija, what's the name of the organization that holds the table that that is doing the CDPA?
I'm sorry, doing the what? Sorry, Ahmed?
That's doing the CDPA table, that's holding that table. That is the climate working group that's, oh, I'm just totally brain farting on the organization.
But you're still at, Ahmed, what I was thinking is that Frankie, for example, is asking what organization you're from. And I thought it would be really helpful for folks to understand how you're structured and how you're bringing together organizations to have these conversations.
Yeah, and I'm putting our website in the chat real quick. It's partnershipfornewamericans.org. And my email is Ahmed at partnershipfornewamericans.org. And like I said, I'm from the National Partnership for New Americans, and the project I run there is called the Climate Justice Collaborative. We are a coalition of 60 plus state and local immigrant rights organizations in 43 states. So our members are all state and local organizations. But then in addition to that, we've been helping to facilitate some broader tables in the immigrant rights space around climate migration. And so some of our key partners, Kaylee Ober, who is going to speak on this call, is with Refugees International. I saw someone mention HIAS in the chat earlier. They're also working on the Climate Displaced Persons Act and part of the table that we're helping facilitate. So those are just a few of the examples. The International Refugee Assistance Project also as a large climate project that we've been working closely with and has close partnerships, I know, with NRDC on some of the legal strategies they've been exploring. So I think there is a lot of work happening in the space and a lot of immigrant rights groups engaging. And if you're looking for specific connections, you can feel free to shoot me an email. Like I said, one of the roles we're trying to play is as a connector between the climate and immigrant rights groups at the local level.
I'm so sorry. I made a mistake. The question was to Dan, but I thought it was really important that Ahmed talks about the connections he has to different groups, but the question was to Dan.
Now, my name is Stan, but that's fine, no problem. I would like you to think about the Climate Reality Project, headed up by Al Gore, covering the entire globe. And we could send something to Ben Sackler in New York, or Washington rather, and get him involved, because we are right now messaging IRA for everybody and BIL. We're messaging those acts, and we had power training for it. And this is another aspect that would be good for Al Gore's group, Climate Reality Project.
Yeah, so thank you, Stan. Stan, you've spoken a lot today. Thank you for your input. Are you affiliated with one of the organizations with Stop the Money Pipeline? I think people have been asking that in the chat.
Okay. Hold on. I gotta get rid of this. Cool.
You could say that in the chat. I put a bunch of resources in the chat for folks to, we're gonna move on. For folks to check out, there's a survey that Stop Money Pipeline has asked. Alana, do you have some closing remarks? And I think Mary Gutierrez is going to close us out. But Alana, I just wanted to make sure if you had anything else to say.
No, I just want to thank you all for hearing us today. And also thank you, Ahmed and Khadija, for your participation. So yeah, that's all from my side.
Mary, do you want to announce the next session next month? And then thank you also to everyone.
Hi, everybody. My name is Mary Gutierrez. I am an organizer and director for Earth Ethics, but I'm also on the Stomp Jedi Committee. And I would just want to thank Nate and the group for putting on this wonderful presentation for us today. And I hope that you guys found it to be educational and engaging. There will be a follow-up email with some of the information that was provided into the chat today. So if you couldn't capture it all, don't panic. We'll get a follow-up email. So the next session that we have, which is the third session in this lineup of this 4-part series, is the prison industrial complex and climate justice, which was mentioned earlier by Jackie, but in case you missed it, that one's going to be on Tuesday, October 10th. If you have not seen the link to join for that, you also get an email with regards to that. So with regards to the prison industrial complex and climate justice, environmental and climate injustice within the prison industrial complex manifests in a multitude of ways. The prison industrial complex is driven by racism, capitalism, and imperialism, and its economic expansion works on the systematic incarceration, exploitation, and disposability of Black, Indigenous, and people of color bodies. It reinforces systems of oppression and disenfranchisement, further marginalizing affected communities and hindering their ability to address and mitigate environmental impacts. Prisons are often strategically located in marginalized communities or near toxic dumping grounds, compounding and deepening the existing environmental burdens and inequities that these already vulnerable communities face. In this workshop, we'll discuss and hear from panelists on how the forces of exploitation and abuse that fuel the climate crisis are also driving the prison industrial complex and what we can do. Thank you very much. Back to you, Nate.
I think that's it. That's October 10th. Is that right? Did you say the date? Okay.
Yes. Tuesday,
okay. Well,
Sorry.
Thank you to everyone that joined tonight. We will definitely follow up with everyone that was on the call, and I really appreciate your time. Have a great evening wherever you are.
Thank you for all your work.
Thank you.
Very informative.
Thanks very much, guys.